I'm here with my friend Tinas, and we are talking about Batman Arkham.
Yeah.
Just the series in general. Look, we needed a break from Easter eggs.
It's true. And we've been really milking that down to its very fine teat.
To be fair, it's like one a month, though.
No, right.
It's like one video a month.
No.
I'm sure people can deal with that.
Yeah. And they're great Easter eggs. We're having a blast with it. But just to spice it up a little bit, get a bigger picture, you know?
Yeah. What actually makes Arkham special, what makes it stand apart from other franchises, from other superhero games, and I guess other media in general, not even just video games? There's a lot to look at here. I think the first thing that we do want to talk about is the story. This is probably the main thing that draws people in, I think. I mean, in terms of fans of these characters.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely say so. And I think even, like, looking at from the very beginning, this whole thing started with Paul Dini was heavily involved, and I think that's a big driving force of everything that we saw here. I mean, they had a big connection to the animated series, and you just felt that vibe and everything coming from the 90s a little bit. It felt like a very 90s-esque Batman that we were getting, with a little bit of a darker twist for sure, and a little bit more darkness in there. And that just kind of kept building all throughout. You get City, which I think is a phenomenal story as well. Origins is different and shorter, but I think still quality. And the whole story of the entire Arkham universe and everything that goes on with that, it's interwoven quite nicely, to be honest. They do a really good job of it. And I really didn't see weaknesses in any of the stories, as far as it just being like a liability in any of the games at all. They were all solid stories, I think.
Yeah, some are more than others. I mean, you can certainly get into there with things like Arkham Knight, especially.
For sure.
Or even elements of Origins, sure, and kind of be like, hey, listen, this could have been better. But none of them were like a disaster or anything like that. They were all still quality stories, and I would argue better than a lot of stories that we get in, I guess, gaming. Not even just superhero games, but gaming in general. There are a lot of good stories for sure, especially some of the stuff like Kojima stuff, like Metal Gear Solid, some of the top tier scripts in gaming, like Fallout New Vegas, things like that. Yeah. The original Last of Us, Not saying anything. No, I don't care if people like to. It's fine. I'm just messing around. Guy, just messing around. But the thing with this is I think that story really does bring people in. It keeps them invested. It keeps them caring about what's going to happen. It's not just a surface level story either. I think it would be very easy to just tell a surface level story and walk away. Okay, mission accomplished. We did a good job. But it's not just that. There's also all these underlying bits of story. I mean, the lore. And not just the lore of things like the animated series, which is its own continuity, but clearly inspired this one. But the lore like the Arkham City stories, right? Or the ones in Arkham Knight, which I always forget the name of.
Interview tapes in Asylum.
Some of which have been decanonized and some have not. That's a weird thing.
It's a weird thing,
because that game was so heavily inspired by the animated series. But yeah, there's so much in the background going on here too. Some people did get very tired of Joker. However, this connection between Batman and Joker, how they play off of each other as opposite sides of the same coin, it's like the themes of the Dark Knight, but spread out over 4 games.
Yeah, I think that was obviously the big picture here, was Batman and Joker the whole way through. We saw him in all 4 games, and he was you could say the main antagonist for the most part was Scarecrow and Knight, and fine, I guess you could say that. But for the most part, it's always been at a much more personal, even intimate level between Batman and the Joker. It's a very intense thing, and they really focused on that in this entire series. Like you said, somewhat to the detriment, and I think a fair amount of fans wished it didn't entirely go in that direction, that maybe that stopped after City. But nonetheless, I think they did a really solid job, even in Night, with exploring that and how they use Joker. And obviously in Asylum and City, I thought they did a great job. And there are some things in there that I think that you're like, well, I wish that maybe he wasn't a giant monster at the end of Asylum. Or, well, maybe he didn't need to be in Origins. But nonetheless, there are some really cool moments that we get out of that, and I think they did a good job of fleshing that out for everyone.
And without becoming an Origins apologist here, I do think that his incorporation in Origins is actually one of the stronger incorporations in the series. It just upset people because they were expecting something else.
The way it was marketed.
Yeah, I think that that's what really hurt that. But if you look at it just in terms of a origin story of their connection, it actually really fills out those themes of this story really well. I would say even probably better than it was in Asylum, where it was a little more impersonal, but there were still elements of it. It's like totally personal in Origins.
For sure.
So yeah, they do a really good job throughout all these, even games like that. Also, one thing we wanted to talk about was the combat. Here's the thing. This did not invent rhythm-based combat. There's always the people who will say, like, well, Spider-Man 2, the movie game, blah, 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 did this, that. Yeah, you're right. It did. However, it wasn't perfected. It was good. You know, it wasn't bad. It was done well. But this kind of came in and really flipped the script on it, to the point where games for years have been copying this. You know, and not even just games outside of WB, their own games. Like, they very clearly copied elements of this in their Shadow of Middle-earth series.
For sure.
Like, really, a lot of it, actually, was sort of used in that game, or I guess game franchise. But you also saw it in the Amazing Spider-Man games. Not as good, but it was copied. You did see it as well in Insomniac Spider-Man. They obviously had their own version of it, but it was very clearly inspired by that. Much to the anger of certain people who don't want to admit that. It's everywhere. I mean, it was like, it went from button mashy to, hey, now you can have superhero games that are intentional combat.
Yeah, and by the time that you get to Night, I think it's clearly the best. The system, obviously, is when it gets to Night, they've really perfected it to the point of where it's at its peak in the entire series. And there really is not much more satisfying than when you're playing and for example, in that game, when you're in the Iceberg Lounge and you're trying to get up to 1,000,000 points to get up to Killer Croc and Penguin and unlock those guys. And you're up to that 500 combo, although in pretty difficult for the most part, but still it's incredibly rewarding when you see
you want
those.
To show that?
Yeah, yeah, dude. Yeah.
Prove it.
Yeah, whatever, man. But like you get up to those high levels, and it's incredibly rewarding, and to see like the leaderboards and to see what other people are doing too that are just like making you look like a complete chump. It's really,
yeah. I love hacked leaderboards too.
Yeah, that's true too. But I mean, it's a really the combat system by itself is challenging, but also you can kind of get a feel for it after you play for a while. You get into that rhythm. You start to you kind of get into the zone. And you start to actually flow with the game, and they throw new enemies at you once you start to get into that flow. You're like, oh, I'm doing well. Well, here's a riot shield to completely ruin everything. Here's a ninja. Yeah, and they just completely ruin everything. You have to kind of get back into that rhythm. And so they really, I think, made it so that you can feel good and really get something going, and then still have challenges in there. And we've done videos on all the different enemies and stuff that you run into. There's a lot of variety that you run into as you're playing as Batman, or even in like some of in Night as well. If you're doing the challenge maps, you're playing as other characters. It still works well with other characters too. I think Robin's combat is really fun. Nightwing's is still really fun. I think it's challenging.
Yeah, be careful there. A few people are real big Nightwing stands. They get upset when you say it's not fun.
No, it's fun.
So be careful.
Nightwing's is still fun, and Catwoman's, I love the fast pace. Harley Quinn's a great time.
Yeah, and they all have their own personality to them too. So for example, Batman is very brooding and angry and sullen and strength. But Catwoman is very sensual, and like
finesse.
Yeah, finesse. I don't want to say womanly, but I guess like that sort of like snake-like movement of like fluid, I guess would be a way to say it, which is different from Batman, which is different from Robin, which is different from Harley Quinn. Like, she doesn't move the same way that Catwoman would. She doesn't move like sultry. She walks that way a little bit, but that's about it. There's a lot of brute strength elements to her combat too, with the bat and all this other stuff. So while the combat functions the same for these characters, it has unique little quirks to it and movements and things like that that give every character personality when you're actually playing the games.
And they all still work well, which is great. Like, especially once you get into Night when it's perfected. And I think when you go back to Asylum and you play through the combat, it's still really fun, but there are some like small annoyances that you'll see. And you'll even see that it's much improved in City, but you'll see some very small things in there as well. Yeah. And so by the time that in Origins, there's some there's some things where you'll hit counter doesn't work, and you'll just see that kind of in those. By the time that you're in Night, they've added in some new features, and it just feels smooth. And it's just like, if you make a mistake, or if a mistake is made in the combat, you know it was you for the most part. You don't really blame the game as much anymore. I think that's a great place to be for a combat system.
Well, yeah, you want that for any game where it's like, if you mess up, it's your fault. I think it's very easy to make a game where the game is so cheap that, well, what was I supposed to do? You don't feel that much, especially in Night itself.
Yes.
For the combat, I agree. Also, speaking of gameplay, I do want to say really quick, we didn't even put this on our docket that we're talking about, but the stealth is really well done. It gets better over the course of the games. I think that the combat is probably more widely known than the stealth in these. It's like more iconic,
right?
This combat system beyond the stealth system, but it was still done very well. It improved over time. It had its own unique aspects to it, like maybe there's a sniper here, maybe there's one here. How do I deal with this jammer? Stuff like that, where it did make you think on the fly and actually, I guess, consider your movements and where you were going to go and who was around you and stuff like that.
What gadgets you were going to use. And that's the thing. One thing that they maybe don't get enough credit for is they almost force you to use some of the gadgets that they give you, where it's like, well, if you don't use this, it's going to be tougher.
Yeah.
Make your life easier. Use this gadget. And especially once again in Night, I think is where you see that the most, is where you've got a ton of gadgets and they throw a variety of enemies at you, whether there's medics in the game that are reviving guys that make it more challenging. You have to take those guys out. It becomes very tactical. And I think you're right. That's a very underrated aspect of it.
Another thing is just the living explorable worlds of each game. Now, some of them better than others. Like, for example, I love Origins, but its living explorable world, not really as good as some of the other games, right? Same with Asylum. It's really a cool world when you go in places and stuff. There's nothing to do once you beat the game, really, other than grab some collectibles. So this is something that I think they improved over time. Each one's good in its own way with its atmosphere and all this other stuff, but I think the Easter eggs are one of the biggest things in this game that we love, or game franchise that we love, because it shows how much is known about the characters, how much actually exists in the universe. It's not just what you see on screen. It's not just the character you see on screen. Prometheus exists in this world in the background. We don't see him. Tweedledee and Tweedledum, they exist. Characters like this are out there in the world, and Batman has encountered them. It's just you're not playing on one of the nights of those encounters.
Yeah, and what's so amazing about these games is that you'll have guys come out, I think in Asylum and City, there were Easter eggs that were coming out like a year or two after where people were finding, has anyone ever seen this before?
Oh, that Warden Sharp office? That took forever. Didn't they have to tease that themselves?
I think they actually had to tell people about it, yeah. And then there was the one in City where you had to go and open that boat and then go down and see everything that was going on with Crane and the Falcone shipping thing. And so there's tons of really small things like that of like Easter eggs. But then there's also, I think one thing that was awesome about these games is as you're flying around, you're getting a bunch of thug conversations that are even opening up things about, they talk about Superman and they talk about things outside of this world. And they even talked about, I think in City they talked about Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, what's next? Arkham World? And they're like,
people were making that joke too. That's the funny thing.
Yeah, and so like there's like conversations that you'll pick up as you're flying around, so you should pay attention to those. And like you go down, and Calendar Man in City was another unreal one where you like physical dates, you need to make sure that you logged in on that day. And I think a lot of people would just go in and change the time on their Xbox or whatever.
No, wait a minute.
Wait, dude,
nobody did that.
No, you're right. Sorry about that.
No, I waited for the specific date. It took me 2 years.
Yeah.
Usually your power happens to go out on Christmas.
Oh my gosh, dude.
You have to fly to a different time zone. Yeah, no, those things were done really well. I completely agree. The world's just... There's some games in the franchise where it could improve, certainly, but overall, big picture, they do feel much more alive than a lot of worlds in gaming do, even to this day. And I think that as games improve, hopefully, as good as these are, they will be seen as kind of the bare bones, of like a living, breathing world type thing, and things will keep improving. But especially at the time of each game's release, they were very impressive in that aspect compared to things around them.
For sure, dude. And like you mentioned earlier too, it was about like the Arkham City stories where they built up things. There was like a world building as to why certain things happened and what was going on with Hugo Strange.
Finding Bane's equipment in Night.
Yes.
And like finding out he left.
Yeah. Or even like the Court of Owls, although we didn't see them, they existed in Origins. Like there's all of these very small things. And what I really appreciated about Asylum, among a million things, were those interview tapes where you got to hear about what happened with Joker and Harley Quinn a little bit in there. You hear that conversation. You hear about Croc biting off Cash's hand. Like, you see these very, like, minuscule conversations that really, like, they mean a lot in the world, but they're explorables that you have to earn and learn more about, which was, I thought it was great.
I agree. Yeah, it was done so well. Also, the voice acting, just, I think this is a brief thing to mention, but it was top tier.
It was, yeah.
Whether it was, Kevin Conroy or, like, Roger Craig Smith, they both did great.
They
honestly.
did.
And you can certainly have preferences for any of these things. I know everyone does. But, like, some of these voice actors don't get enough credit, I don't think. Like, for example, Troy Baker's Joker was really good. Now, everybody talks about Mark Hamill's, and I think it goes without saying that he's phenomenal. Like, do we have to say it?
Not at all.
Everyone knows
obvious,
it. Like,
yeah.
what am I going to add to it that someone hasn't said?
Right.
But, like, Troy Baker did such a good job in Origins as Joker, and there's a lot of characters like that in this franchise who maybe don't get a lot of recognition for their role, for what they did, but they did help breathe life into these characters and bring it, alive. It would be very different if there was no audio spoken lines. You just read it all or something. That would be very different. Now, there are games that work very well that way. Pokemon, older Final Fantasies, stuff like that, they work fantastically that way. But this element, it made it feel like parts of it were a movie. It was a live story unfolding in front of you, but with you as an active participant and not just an observer.
Yeah, well, especially in Asylum when things really did feel like the animated series. You had Conroy, Hamill, Arlene Sorkin was voicing Harley Quinn, and I think someone who doesn't really get enough credit was, Sorkin is the original Harley Quinn. She's fantastic in the animated series. She's great in Asylum. But Tara Reid, I think is it
Tara Strong?
Tara Strong, that's who it is, yeah. Tara Strong takes over in City and takes over from there, and she's awesome. Like, she's a fantastic Harley Quinn. And I think Sorkin is still my favorite. She's the original, and I think she's awesome at it. But Tara Strong was great fulfilling that role the rest of the way, too.
Yeah, they're all so good. Also, I think the final thing, too, is the character design. Everyone has their preferences with character design, especially. This is one of the more subjective things that's actually hard to tackle. You can, I think mostly, if there is a horrendous character design, most people can get on board with, yeah, that's bad. But generally, if it's anywhere in the middle or, leaning towards good or leaning maybe a little towards bad, there will always be someone who loves it, The thing with Arkham is that I think that they consistently always leaned towards good character designs on pretty much everything. Now, we do have ones that we don't like very much at all, or ones that we've criticized before, like Massive Bane, for example, from Asylum. Thought that was a missed opportunity. Things like Killer Croc, who was experimented on and becomes more crocly and very large and pudgy. Just, but they're not even awful character designs. It's more just like they could have been really cool, and they dropped the ball.
There was more potential there,
compared to what they had done before. Like, you look at some of the best character designs in this franchise. Batman himself in pretty much every game. People will have their criticisms again.
Giant cape in the first one.
Looks a little Iron Man-y in Night, and a little bulky in Origins. Yeah, totally. There's things that people will critique, but he looks fantastic generally in each game. Joker looks really good. Honestly, Bane in Origins looks phenomenal.
Yeah.
Harley Quinn in most of them, I think, looks really, really good. I know that this kicked off a little bit of the age of people missing her Harlequin suit, but she had sort of the same look forever, and this sort of reinvented her look in a lot of ways and made it different. There was a lot done here, both in novel concepts and trying to, I guess, create their own version of the characters, while also staying true to the heart of them from those comic book and cartoon characters themselves.
They definitely did. Yeah, they respected the original context of everything that came along with these characters, but also made it their own. And I think that, like you said, there were some in there where it was like, I don't know if I love that. I think there was a different direction they maybe could have gone that I would have liked more. But nonetheless, Rocksteady kind of just stayed true to what they wanted to do with the characters. And they thought that whatever fit best with what they were doing. And even the characters as they developed through each game, and you got a different look, and like that looks a little bit different. Nothing stayed the same, which I think was good. I think that was one thing that they did well, is that it didn't get stagnant. It was like, oh, well, what's Harley Quinn going to look like in City after she changed? And then like, oh, even in the DLC, in Harley Quinn's Revenge, she looked a little bit different. And then you go to Night, and she's still different. It was just, there was a lot going on from each game, and each character seemed to change and evolve, which was, I think, something that helped show their character development as they went along too. So the character design was fantastic all throughout.
It was done really well. Hey, before we wrap up, we have this very brief self-sponsor from me about our reworked Patreon. The Degenerate J Patreon has been completely reworked, revamped, and dare I say, reloaded with much retribution. Now with access to over 80, that is right, 80 and increasing by the week. Exclusive patron-only videos when you sign up today. Be sure to check it out in the description down below. You will also gain access to behind-the-scenes posts, images, and thank you videos every month, along with thank you shout-outs. I appreciate your support so much on this channel. Thank you for supporting independent creators on YouTube and other platforms, and let's hop right into it. So anyway, these are our thoughts on what makes Arkham so special. This is a bit of a long one, probably 19, 20 minutes, but it's such a fantastic franchise. There's so much going on here. We backed off of it a little bit on this channel. I've said it before because I don't want to beat it into the ground. I want to enjoy it and talk about it when it feels good to talk about, not every day, and do different stuff. But there's a reason that we come back to Arkham so often. It's not because it gets views. It's because it's fun, The franchise is so special. There's a lot here that other games, without directly copying, should be looking at for inspiration and saying, how can I be like that? And I think that that's how any franchise should strive to be the guy who is like, how do we be like that guy? That's what Arkham is. So anyways, let us know what you think in the comments down below. Be sure to leave your recommendations down there for T's new nickname. I am leaning towards Teenus, but Teabag is another one that people have been considering actually and talking about. I really much like that one. So let us know what you think. We'll see you in the next one. Have a fantastic day. And before I say, as always, please check out all the links in the description down below. Thriving Discord, awesome social media. I hope that you'll join, and stay shway.